It is June 27th, 1976. Air France Flight 139 lifts off from Athens International Airport, bound for Paris. On board, 248 passengers, 12 crew, and a nightmare that no one on that aircraft yet understands. 40 minutes into the flight, 4 individuals stand up simultaneously. They are armed. Within seconds, the aircraft is no longer a commercial airliner. It is a weapon. The hijackers redirect the aircraft south, then southwest, then further, past the Mediterranean, past the continent of Africa, deep into the equatorial interior. Their destination, Entebbe International Airport, Uganda. Their patron, Idi Amin, dictator, self-proclaimed field marshal, a man who will greet them with handshakes. The hostages number in the hundreds. The distance from Israel, the country whose citizens make up the majority of those hostages, is 4,000 kilometers. The negotiating position of the Israeli government is, as always, that it does not negotiate with terrorists. So they will not negotiate, and they will plan. What follows over the next 7 days is one of the most precisely engineered special operations in military history. A mission planned in less than a week, executed at night across 4,000 kilometers against an armed force on foreign soil without the knowledge or consent of any regional government. In 90 minutes, it will be over. This is how the system worked. To understand Operation Entebbe, or Operation Thunderbolt, as the Israeli Defense Forces officially designated it, you must first understand the strategic landscape of the 1970s. The decade of the 1970s was, in many ways, the golden age of politically motivated aircraft hijacking. The tactic had been refined throughout the late 1960s by Palestinian militant groups, most prominently the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, as a means of achieving international attention, releasing imprisoned comrades, and demonstrating the reach and capability of the Palestinian resistance movement. Between 1968 and 1977, there were more than 300 airline hijackings worldwide. The tactic was so common that it had generated its own counter-industry. Sky marshals, metal detectors, behavioral profiling at airports. But the frequency of attacks had also, perversely, normalized them. Western governments had developed negotiating frameworks. Hijackers had learned what concessions were achievable. Israel occupied a unique position in this landscape. Since its founding in 1948, through 4 major wars, continuous low-intensity conflict, and near-constant terrorist attack, it had developed a national security doctrine built on several hard principles. One of those principles was non-negotiation with terrorists, not as a rhetorical posture, as operational doctrine. The reasoning was strategic, not emotional. Negotiating with terrorists creates incentives for more terrorism. Every prisoner exchange signals that hostage-taking is productive. The doctrine of non-negotiation was intended to remove that incentive entirely. The problem with doctrines is that they must survive contact with reality. And in June of 1976, reality arrived at 4,000 kilometers range. Air France Flight 139 originated in Tel Aviv, made a scheduled stop in Athens, and was continuing to Paris. The Athens stopover was relevant. Athenian airport security in 1976 was notoriously porous, and it was through Athens that the 4 hijackers, 2 members of the PFLP's External Operations Branch and 2 members of the German revolutionary cells, the Revolutionäre Zellen, boarded the aircraft without detection. The team was led by Wilfried Bose and Brigitte Kuhlmann on the German side, and by 2 PFLP operatives. one of whom used the alias Antonio. The international composition of the team was deliberate. The German members were European, years which made them easier to infiltrate past Israeli-focused security screening. The Palestinian members provided the organizational backing and ideological direction. The hijacking was swift and disciplined. Within minutes of seizing control, the aircraft was redirected to Benghazi, Libya for refueling, then onward to Entebbe. Uganda, in 1976, was ruled by Idi Amin, who had seized power in a military coup in 1971. By 1976, his regime had become internationally isolated due to widespread human rights atrocities, but he maintained relationships with several Arab governments and with the PLO. He had previously expelled the Israeli military advisors who had helped build Uganda's armed forces after independence. He now welcomed the hijackers with formal military honors. The aircraft landed at Entebbe on the evening of June 28th. Ugandan military forces surrounded it, ostensibly as a security escort, functionally as additional armed guards. The hijackers' position was now reinforced by the Ugandan army. The hijackers' demands were specific and deadline-driven, a standard feature of politically motivated hostage operations designed to create time pressure that forces concessions before a systematic response can be organized. The primary demand was the release of 53 prisoners held in Israel, France, Switzerland, West Germany, and Kenya. The deadline was July 1st, 1976, later extended to July 4th, America's bicentennial, a date chosen for its symbolic resonance in Western media coverage. The hijackers also made a decision with profound strategic implications. They separated the hostages. Israeli and Jewish passengers, approximately 100 individuals, were segregated from the non-Israeli passengers and held in a separate area of the old terminal building at Entebbe Airport. The non-Israeli passengers were released and flown out, and this act of separation served the hijackers' purposes. It clarified their target population, reduced the logistical complexity of managing a large hostage group, and, they believed, reduced international pressure by removing non-Israeli nationals from the equation. It also had an unintended effect that would prove fatal to the operation. By concentrating the hostages in a defined location, the hijackers had created a fixed target. From the moment the aircraft landed at Entebbe, the Israeli security establishment began working against the clock. 7 days, later extended slightly, to find an option that doctrine prohibited them from calling impossible. The planning challenge was, on its face, prohibitive. Entebbe was 4,000 kilometers from Israeli territory. Uganda was a hostile state. The hostages were held inside a building guarded by both terrorists and Ugandan army soldiers. There was no obvious staging area, no allied country willing to provide basing, no pre-positioned forces, no current intelligence on the ground layout of Entebbe Airport. The Israeli response to this problem illustrates a principle that defines effective military intelligence work: the systematic conversion of uncertainty into structured knowledge. The intelligence effort began immediately and ran on multiple parallel tracks. The Mossad activated its network of human intelligence sources throughout East Africa. Sapir, former Israeli military advisors who had served in Uganda, expelled by Amin in 1972, were contacted for their knowledge of Entebbe Airport's layout. The Israeli construction firm that had built the old terminal at Entebbe was identified, and its blueprints were obtained. This would prove critical. Israeli planners had near-complete architectural plans of the building where the hostages were held. Released hostages were debriefed immediately upon their arrival in France and Israel. Each interview added data points: the number of guards, their positions, their rotation schedules, the placement of weapons, the locations where hostages were held within the terminal, the behavioral patterns of both the hijackers and the Ugandan soldiers. Accumulated across dozens of interviews, this built a surprisingly detailed operational picture. Technical intelligence was also gathered. Satellite imagery of Entebbe Airport, obtained through channels that remain partially classified, provided current overhead views of the airfield. Israeli Air Force intelligence analyzed the imagery to identify aircraft positions, vehicle movements, guard posts, and the condition of the runway. The result of this parallel intelligence effort, conducted over 4 to 5 days, was an operational picture that would have taken most military organizations weeks to assemble. And this speed was not accidental. It reflected decades of investment in human intelligence networks, signals intelligence capability, and, critically, an organizational culture that treated intelligence not as a separate staff function, but as the foundation of operational planning. With intelligence flowing in, Israeli military planners, specifically the Operations Directorate of the Israel Defense Forces and representatives of the Special Operations community, began working through options. The options ranged from negotiated release, which the political echelon had not ruled out entirely, to a range of military alternatives. The military alternatives were arrayed on a spectrum of risk and complexity. A naval operation was considered and rejected. The geography made it infeasible. A parachute assault was studied. The risk of injury and dispersion was too high. A helicopter assault from a forward base was examined. No forward base was available. On what remained was a direct airborne assault. Landing aircraft directly on the Entebbe runway, deploying assault teams, executing the rescue, and departing under the same air power that had brought them in. This approach required overflying hostile or non-permissive airspace, operating at extreme range from any support, and achieving complete tactical surprise. While the option was assessed as having a very high probability of success under one condition, that the element of surprise was maintained until the moment the assault team entered the terminal building. Any early warning, a radar detection, a communications intercept, a compromised intelligence source, would collapse the operation. The entire architecture of the plan was therefore built around preserving that surprise. The deception architecture of Operation Thunderbolt was multi-layered. At the strategic level, Israeli negotiators continued public negotiations with the hijackers through Idi Amin as intermediary, requesting deadline extensions, appearing to discuss the possibility of partial concessions. This signaling was intended to convince the hijackers that Israel was moving toward compliance, reducing their alertness. At the operational level, the flight profile of the assault aircraft was designed to exploit specific seams in East African radar coverage. The aircraft would fly at low altitude over portions of the route, reducing radar cross-section. Flight timing would minimize the probability of detection during critical segments. The aircraft would fly in formation, consistent with a civilian cargo flight, on routes that East African air traffic control would not flag as unusual. At the tactical level, the assault force planned to use a specific deception that has become legendary in the literature of special operations. A black Mercedes staff car and Land Rovers consistent with Idi Amin's personal motorcade. Amin was known to make late-night visits to the airport. The assault team's initial approach to the terminal would therefore look, from a distance and in darkness, like a presidential visit. This deception needed to hold for approximately 40 seconds. And 40 seconds was all the assault team needed. The operation was assigned to Sayeret Matkal, the General Staff's reconnaissance unit, Israel's premier counterterrorism and strategic special operations force. Sayeret Matkal was, and remains, a unit whose existence was not publicly acknowledged for decades. Its operators are selected from the top of each IDF conscript class, subjected to a multi-year selection and training process, and specialize in deep penetration operations, hostage rescue, and direct action against high-value targets. The unit had specific operational experience relevant to hostage rescue. In 1972, Sayeret Matkal had executed Operation Isotope, the rescue of hostages from a Sabina Airlines aircraft at Tel Aviv's Lod Airport. The unit had also been involved in planning and rehearsal for scenarios very similar to what it now faced. The Entebbe operation was not Sayeret Matkal's first encounter with this type of problem. It was the most extreme version of it, and the assault force for Entebbe was organized into several functional elements. The primary assault team, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Yonatan Netanyahu, older brother of Benjamin Netanyahu, who would later become Prime Minister, was responsible for entering the terminal building and neutralizing the hijackers. Secondary elements were assigned to secure the aircraft, neutralize any Ugandan military response, destroy Uganda Air Force aircraft on the ground to prevent pursuit, and hold the perimeter while hostages were loaded for extraction. The total force that landed at Entebbe comprised approximately 100 commandos, supported by a larger logistical and medical element aboard the accompanying aircraft. 4. Lockheed C-13 O Hercules transport aircraft formed the backbone of the air component. The C-130 was the logical choice. It had the range for the mission profile with appropriate refueling, the cargo capacity to carry both the assault force and the vehicles they would use in the assault, and the ability to operate on short or degraded runways. A relevant capability given uncertainty about the condition of Entebbe's surface. 2 Boeing 707 aircraft accompanied the C-130 formation. One was configured as an airborne command post, carrying senior IDF commanders who would oversee the operation in real time. The second was configured as a flying medical facility, a decision that reflected both the IDF's approach to casualty management and the recognition that wounded hostages would need immediate surgical capability, not a 4-hour flight before treatment. The entire air fleet flew without fighter escort. Israel had no fighters with the range to accompany the strike package to Uganda and return. The protection against interception was stealth, staying below radar, flying at night, avoiding the corridors where African air defense assets were concentrated. The operation was rehearsed in a time frame that defies conventional military planning cycles. From the receipt of actionable intelligence on the terminal layout to the execution of the operation, planners had approximately 3 to 4 days of rehearsal time. A full-scale mock-up of the old terminal building was constructed at a military facility in Israel, reportedly at an air base in the Negev, using the architectural blueprints obtained through intelligence collection. The assault team rehearsed the entry and clearance of the terminal until they could execute it in near darkness, at combat speed, without verbal communication. Rehearsal in special operations serves multiple functions beyond physical preparation, and it builds the shared mental model, the common operational picture, that allows small teams to operate with minimal communication under combat stress. Each rehearsal iteration identifies friction points, the angle of entry that creates a momentary blind spot, the distance between guard stations that affects timing, the position of supporting weapons that provides or denies overlapping fields of fire. These details, refined through repetition, are what separate a successful assault from a catastrophic one. By the time the aircraft departed, each member of the assault team had executed the terminal clearance sequence multiple times. The 40-second window between the deception vehicles entering the compound and the assault team reaching the terminal door had been stress-tested against the expected guard response times. The operation launched on the evening of July 3, 1976. Political authorization had come from Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin's cabinet after a tense debate. The military had presented a plan with a high probability of success, but success in special operations is never certain, and the consequences of failure, in both human and strategic terms, were severe. Rabin authorized the mission. The aircraft departed from Sharm el-Sheikh, a southern Israeli airfield that provided the optimal southern approach to the route. When the flight profile took the formation south over the Red Sea, then into the African continent, following a track designed to minimize exposure to radar coverage. The aircraft flew at low altitude over critical segments, increasing fuel consumption but reducing detection probability. The formation arrived over Entebbe at approximately 2300 local time on July 3rd. The timing was deliberate. Midnight operations maximized the advantages of darkness while catching security forces in the low alertness phase of the night. The approach was flown without radio communication on Entebbe's control frequencies. The C-130s descended onto the runway as if executing a normal landing. Entebbe's airfield lights were partially on. Ugandan ground crews were expecting a British VC-10 flight, which inadvertently illuminated the runway for the assault aircraft. When the lead C-130 landed and immediately began its ground roll toward the old terminal building, the black Mercedes and Land Rovers were driven off the rear loading ramp while the aircraft was still moving, a technique that required precise coordination between the aircraft commander and the vehicle drivers. Any mistiming meant vehicles damaged, men injured, and the assault compromised before it began. The vehicles moved toward the terminal. Ugandan sentries at the airport periphery observed what appeared to be a motorcade. Two sentries challenged the vehicles. One was silenced with a suppressed weapon. The deception had held long enough. The assault team, led by Lieutenant Colonel Netanyahu, dismounted from the vehicles at approximately 40 meters from the terminal entrance and advanced on foot. They were through the doors within seconds. The interior of the terminal was organized, as the intelligence picture had suggested, and the hostages were seated or lying on the floor in the large hall. The hijackers were distributed at multiple points, at the entrance, at the far end of the hall, and on elevated positions that provided them oversight of the hostage group. The assault team used a communications protocol common to hostage rescue operations. A simultaneous announcement in Hebrew telling hostages to get down, followed immediately by engagement of all identified threats, and the interval between announcement and engagement was measured in fractions of a second. Enough time for hostages to react, not enough time for hijackers to use hostages as shields. All 4 hijackers were killed. The terminal clearance took less than 2 minutes. The cost was 1 hostage killed in the crossfire, 3 hostages who ran toward what they believed was safety and were killed by Ugandan soldiers outside the terminal, and Lieutenant Colonel Yonatan Netanyahu, killed by a Ugandan sniper firing from the control tower as he moved the hostage column toward the aircraft. Netanyahu was the only IDF member killed in the operation. While the terminal assault was in progress, secondary elements of the force were executing their assigned tasks on a parallel timeline. The Ugandan military barracks adjacent to the airport were engaged to prevent a coordinated response, and the goal was not destruction of the Ugandan force. It was suppression and delay. Every minute of Ugandan military confusion was a minute of extraction time. On the airfield apron, a dedicated element destroyed 11 MiG-17 and MiG-21 aircraft belonging to the Uganda Air Force. This was a deliberate force protection measure. Ugandan fighters, if scrambled, could potentially intercept the slow-moving C-130s during the initial outbound flight. By eliminating them on the ground, The assault force removed the aerial threat entirely. The destruction of the Ugandan aircraft has sometimes been criticized as an overstep, an act of war against a sovereign nation beyond the minimum necessary for the hostage rescue. It reflects a principle embedded in Israeli military doctrine. In an operation where the extraction phase is the most vulnerable, you eliminate all potential threats to that extraction rather than hope they do not materialize. And the hostages were moved from the terminal to the waiting C-130s. This phase, the loading and extraction, was the moment of maximum vulnerability. The assault team was now managing approximately 100 individuals, many of them in various states of physical and psychological distress, in an active military environment, on an airfield that was beginning to see Ugandan military response. The medical staff on the aircraft immediately began triaging casualties. The seriously wounded required intravenous lines, trauma care, and stabilization for the flight north. The operation had planned for a refueling stop at Nairobi, Kenya, which had covertly agreed to provide this support. Kenya's willingness to assist, politically sensitive given its African Union relationships, reflected the intelligence cooperation between the two countries and the personal relationship between Israeli and Kenyan security services. The medical team also offloaded the most critically wounded hostages in Nairobi for immediate hospital care. The final aircraft departed Entebbe at approximately 0:40 on July 4th. The entire operation, from first wheels down to last wheels up, had taken 99 minutes. Analyzing Operation Thunderbolt as a military system rather than a dramatic narrative requires identifying the causal factors that drove success. First, intelligence quality and speed. The 72-hour intelligence cycle that produced a workable operational picture of a facility 4,000 kilometers away was not the product of luck. It was the product of a pre-existing network of human intelligence assets, strong relationships with former military advisors, and an institutional culture that treated intelligence collection as an operational emergency rather than a staff process. And the architectural blueprints of the terminal building, obtained through a construction company database, were perhaps the single most operationally valuable piece of intelligence in the entire package. Second, rehearsal under realistic conditions. The full-scale mock-up construction and repetitive rehearsal converted uncertainty into procedural confidence. In the terminal assault, the team was not executing a plan they had been briefed on. They were executing a sequence they had physically repeated until it was automatic. This distinction between knowing a plan and having internalized a plan is the difference between a team that thinks during an assault and a team that acts during an assault. Under combat stress, the team that thinks is dangerously slow. Third, integrated command and control. The airborne command post aboard the Boeing 707 placed senior IDF leadership in a position to observe the operation in real time and make decisions if the situation deviated from the plan. This is not the same as micromanagement. The assault team operated with full tactical autonomy once wheels were on the ground. But having decision authority in the air, rather than in Tel Aviv, reduced the command loop from hours to minutes. Fourth, the deception plan. The black Mercedes motorcade has become legendary, but its significance is often misunderstood. It was not the centerpiece of the deception. It was the final layer of it. The broader deception ran from the strategic level through the operational level to the tactical level. Each layer served a specific function and was designed to fail gracefully. The death of Yonatan Netanyahu is examined in every serious analysis of Operation Thunderbolt. Not because it represents a failure of planning, but because it illustrates the irreducible risk inherent in any special operation. Netanyahu was shot by a Ugandan soldier firing from the control tower, a position that intelligence had identified, that was engaged by the assault force, but from which a single shot found its mark during the movement of hostages to the aircraft. The mechanics of his death, the angle of fire, the moment of exposure, the response of the Ugandan soldier, were precisely the type of low-probability event that no planning process can eliminate. The analysis here is not that the planning was flawed. It is that special operations always contain a residual probability of catastrophic individual loss that cannot be planned away. What planning can do is minimize exposure time, maximize suppression of known threats, and build in redundancy so that the loss of a single leader does not collapse the mission. Further, in the case of Entebbe, the mission continued despite Netanyahu's death because the command structure was robust enough to absorb the loss. Operation Thunderbolt was studied intensively by military organizations worldwide in the years following 1976. It influenced the development of counterterrorism doctrine in the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and numerous other countries. Several doctrinal principles that are now standard in special operations planning were either developed or validated by the Entebbe operation. The principle of full-scale mock-up rehearsal became standard practice in hostage rescue planning. The principle that intelligence quality is the binding constraint on special operation success was reinforced. The principle of parallel planning, where multiple operational elements execute simultaneous tasks on a coordinated timeline, was refined. The operation also had a profound effect on airline security architecture. The vulnerability demonstrated by the Athens departure point, where the hijackers had boarded without detection, directly accelerated the development of behavioral profiling systems. The immediate geopolitical consequences of Operation Thunderbolt were significant. Uganda lodged a formal protest at the United Nations, characterizing the Israeli operation as an act of aggression against a sovereign nation. That several African and Arab states supported the protest. The UN Security Council debated the matter, but no resolution condemning Israel was passed. The operation had demonstrated that the Israeli government was willing and capable of conducting military operations of this complexity at this range against this level of opposition. This had deterrence value beyond the immediate tactical success. Idi Amin's personal prestige suffered a significant blow. He had staked his international reputation on the success of the hijacking as a demonstration of solidarity with the Palestinian cause. The Israeli operation, executed under his nose and against his army, reduced him to a figure of ridicule in international diplomatic circles. His regime would collapse within 3 years. Operation Thunderbolt endures in military history not because it was dramatic, though it was, but because it was a nearly perfect expression of a specific type of military capability. It demonstrated that a small, well-trained, well-led force with excellent intelligence could project decisive power at extreme range against a defended objective. It also demonstrated the limits of that capability. The operation worked because every element of the system performed at or above the required standard in sequence without catastrophic failure. Yonatan Netanyahu's death is a permanent reminder that the most meticulously planned operation still sends human beings into a domain where the variables cannot all be controlled. But the system, the intelligence architecture, the rehearsal methodology, the deception planning, the integrated command structure, the medical capability, the diplomatic groundwork with Kenya, is what made it possible to get 102 hostages out of the heart of Africa in 99 minutes. Structure determined the outcome, and the E. That is always where the analysis begins. You have been watching the command structure. Subscribe if you think in systems.